Ja, einen schönen guten Morgen. Danke für die Geduld. Wir sind ein bisschen im Zeitverzug, weil das Organisieren der Datenjournalisten in einer noch zu bestimmenden Organisationsform etwas länger gedauert hat, was aber eigentlich ein gutes Zeichen ist, würde ich jetzt einfach mal behaupten irgendwie. Heute ist ein Schwerpunktthema des Tages tatsächlich auch, wie sich der Datenjournalismus in einem Bereich weiterentwickelt hat, über den man vielleicht vor 5 Jahren oder vor 10 Jahren noch gar nicht so gesprochen hat, nämlich den Umgang mit Falschinformationen, wie sie sich verbreitet, wie man sie digital aufspüren kann und. Alles aus meiner Sicht jedenfalls ein Feld, was absolut zum Datenjournalismus gehört, weil wer soll damit kompetent umgehen, wenn nicht Menschen, die auch ja, mit Daten umgehen können. Und ich bin sehr froh, dass wir zu diesem Thema als Auftakt Stephan Lewandowski zu Gast haben. Ich kann ihn auf Deutsch einführen, weil er gebürtiger Berliner ist, arbeitet aber inzwischen an der Universität in Bristol, lange Zeit in Australien, beziehungsweise ist eine Doppel-Affiliation auch, ne? Also University of Western Australia. Und ich kann behaupten, einige der Studierenden hier würden das bestätigen. Er ist sicherlich einer derjenigen, die ich regelmäßig in Veranstaltungen zitiere. Unter anderem mit diesem Werk findet sich auch im Netz, wo es darum geht, wie man eigentlich, wenn man Falschinformationen gefunden hat, wie man sie richtig widerlegt, indem man sie zum Beispiel eben nicht ständig wiederholt. Ich bringe dann gerne das Beispiel, stellen Sie sich vor, Sie haben gehört von mir, dass ich ein Alkoholproblem habe, dann wäre es eine dumme Idee, wenn ich mich jetzt hinstellen würde und sagen, es stimmt nicht, dass ich ein Alkoholproblem habe, weil auf der Zeika in 5 Jahren treffen sie sich da vorne beim Bier und reden darüber, mit dem Wormer, da war doch irgendwas mit Alkohol. Ja, genau, nämlich nichts. Kognitionswissenschaftlich wird das nicht verblassen, Herr Lewandowski. Ne? Ich habe Ihr Beispiel sozusagen übertragen auf mein Alkoholproblem, das ich nicht habe. Ich müsste also, wenn ich das widerlegen wollte, müsste ich sagen, so wie Herr Dambeck hier, ich trinke nur Apfelsaft. Das wollte ich nur einmal hier zu Protokoll geben. Ich wiederhole gar nicht die falsche Information, sondern ersetze die falsche Information gleich durch eine richtige. Das ist jetzt ganz kurz zusammengefasst das, was hier drin steht und was viele Arbeiten von Herrn Lewandowski, ich sag mal, in populärwissenschaftlicher Form zusammenfasst. Heute geht es aber noch um was anderes. Wir sind sehr dankbar, dass Boris Johnson ihn hier hat herreisen lassen zu uns. Das war unvermeidlich. Es geht aber nicht mehr um Boris Johnson, sondern es geht um Donald Trump heute. Und es geht darum, wie man sehen kann, wie auch bestimmte Strategien ja, dazu führen in den Social Media, die Donald Trump anwendet, dass wir von bestimmten Themen abgelenkt werden, ganz strategisch. Und das ist im Wesentlichen der Titel auch des Vortrags. Mr. Lewandowski, Herr Lewandowski, warm welcome. Thank you very much that you are here.
Okay, thanks very much for coming, and thanks for having me. I've never been to Dortmund before, and it's a fantastic place. I love that train going past the door here. So yeah, today I want to talk about my research over the last couple of years, and I want to weave together a number of problems that are associated with the post-truth world, which is what everybody is talking about these days. Now, here's the problem. The first part of the problem is that, just to illustrate, Donald Trump has made about 12,000 false claims in roughly 1,000 days of presidency, 12 per day. That's a problem. But equally, it's a problem that apparently this has made no dent to his approval rating. There isn't a clear decline of his approval. And when you look at the type of misstatements that he's making or that his team is making, then you find that it differs a little from the standard politician sort of challenging relationship with the truth. Here's one example from the day after Donald Trump was inaugurated, where his press secretary, Sean Spicer, said that his crowd was the largest audience to ever witness inauguration. Now, if you look at the two photos below, the left is Donald Trump, on the right we have Barack Obama, then it's very clear that more people attended Obama's inauguration than Donald Trump's. And that's true even if you assume that a lot of people in white hoods don't show up against that white background. So there's no question that this was wrong. But that doesn't matter because according to Donald Trump, we shouldn't trust our own lying eyes. We should only listen to what he's telling us to believe. That's effectively what the statement means. And one of his associates, his lawyer actually, this is what's fascinating, said on live TV that truth isn't truth. And in the United Kingdom, which is not far behind, well, actually we're competing with Donald Trump for the leading position in the race to the bottom. Here's a personality, a British personality, who was very explicit saying fact is an antiquated expression. There is no such thing as fact anymore. And indeed, that is now a tradition in American politics because some politicians or spokespeople just make stuff up. Here's one thing that was made up by Kellyanne Conway, one of Trump's sort of spokespeople. They invented a terrorist event in the United States that never ever happened. Now that invention has not kept some people from surviving this massacre and believing that it has happened. So something has changed over the last couple of years. Politicians have always had difficulty being truthful at all times. But somehow, what has happened over the last 3 years arguably has shifted the spectrum of permissible discourse. And we now are confronted with what I would call, following Hall et al., lying demagogues. That is, people who just lie because they feel that they can get away with it. And they do. So that raises some important questions, and I want to touch on those questions briefly today, with an emphasis on the last question about how the media handle lying demagogues. But before we get there, I want to briefly examine why politicians can get away with what they're doing now, and how this relates to the public's perception of honesty and veracity and truthfulness. So here's a study that we published a little while ago, which was conducted during the primaries in the United States. So we recruited subjects in America in 2016, and we presented them with statements by Donald Trump that were true or false. So, for example, we would present our participants with a claim or with a true statement that Donald Trump said that vaccines cause autism. But the statement by Donald Trump was false in that case. There's no evidence for vaccines causing autism. Or we would present people with a statement that Donald Trump said that the US spent $2 trillion on the war in Iraq, which is true. And so what we asked people was for their belief in those statements. After we had obtained that belief rating, we corrected the false statements, or we affirmed the true statements. So we gave feedback on the statements by Donald Trump, and we asked for belief ratings again, either immediately or a week later. And here are the data. Ignore the panel on the left. That's less interesting for present purposes. And what I'm showing you on the right are people's belief ratings starting out on the left before we explain anything about the statements, then immediately afterwards, or a week later. Now, ignore the color for now and focus on the fact that there are solid lines and dashed lines. The solid lines refer to facts, that is, true statements by Donald Trump. And what you can see for facts is that if we tell people they're correct, their belief ratings increases. And then it declines a little a week later. That's called forgetting. People are just no longer totally sure what we told them. For the dashed lines, on the other hand, we tell them that's false, and people's belief ratings decline. They bounce back a little. Again, that's called forgetting. But it appears as though people are sensitive to our intervention, to our correction. They start out not differentiating much between facts and falsehoods. I mean, there's a little bit of an advantage of the facts over the falsehoods, but that tiny advantage of facts actually becomes rather large after we intervene. So that's kind of good news, and it's even better news if you now turn to the color of the lines, because the color refers to partisanship. The blue lines refer to Democrats, red, Republicans, and the purpley lines were people that existed at the time who were Republicans but did not support Trump. And if you look at the lines, you can find some effect of partisanship. You know, Trump supporters believed the misstatements more than Democrats to begin with, but then they were surprisingly synchronized in their response to our correction. So, where is the post-truth world in this? Well, the post-truth world is in this slide and something else I have to tell you about the data, which is the effect of our intervention not on people's belief of the specifics, but on how they feel about Donald Trump. What I'm showing you on the left here are voting intentions. What I'm showing you on the right are people's feelings towards Donald Trump. And there's absolutely no effect of our manipulation on that. The only thing that matters is pre-existing attitudes. People who loved Donald Trump before they took our study continued to do so, and they felt good about him. Those who didn't like him continued to dislike him. Moreover, if you look at the correlations between the degree of belief change that our intervention affected and people's shift in voting intentions, you find that there is absolutely no correlation. This is something we've replicated twice, I think now, in one case with an imbalance of true to false statements. So we presented 4 false statements to 1 true statement to really hammer home the point that Donald Trump is not particularly honest. And yet we basically do not find much of a shift in voting intentions. And Brendan Nyhan and his colleagues have replicated that using a different methodology. They find precisely the same thing, this sort of dissociation between people's willingness to accept a correction of a factual statement, but they do so without that changing their opinion about Donald Trump in the slightest. So why do people accept demagogues like that? Why are people okay with that? In fact, in public opinion surveys in the US, Republicans, by a 3-to-1 margin, think that Donald Trump is honest. And these are recent data. This isn't from years ago. This is after he has made, thousands and thousands of false statements in public. Republicans still think he's honest. Why is that? Well, one line of thought, which I subscribe to and I find convincing, is that Donald Trump's lies, let's call them lies because that's what they are, they're not a bug, they're a feature. Because what Donald Trump is doing, and so does Boris Johnson, every time he's lying, is to violate a norm of civil society, an establishment norm. I can get away with lying. I am therefore an authentic opponent of the establishment, and I'm an authentic champion of the real people. It is a signaling function that by lying, I am violating norms of the establishment. By saying education is no good, I'm violating norms of the establishment. I'm therefore signaling that I'm on the side of the real people. However I want to define those, usually they're people in pickup trucks with shotguns. Now, there's experimental evidence that I don't have time to talk about. Very interesting study by Hall et al., where they show that you can turn on and off whether or not people accept being lied to as a function of whether or not they believe that the system they're working in is fair. If people lose trust or belief in the fairness of a democratic system, then they will accept a lying demagogue and consider them to be authentic and prefer that authenticity to honesty. And once they get there, people do very interesting things. Here is a study that was done, I think, a day or two after the inauguration. And I'm going back to the two photos I've shown you before, because these are now experimental stimuli in that study by Schaffner and Lux. And they asked members of the public, right after this became a controversy in the United States, which of these two photos has more people in it, photo A or photo B? They made no mention of the inauguration. They just showed these two photos and said, click here if photo A has more people, click there if photo B has more people. A very complicated experimental task, right? You see this, you click the photo with more people in it. Here are the data. These are now error rates because photo A has fewer people in it. And let me just be totally clear here. That is the wrong response. I am not prepared to debate with you or anyone else whether there are fewer people here than there. We know that there were fewer people in photo A. Now that's an important point to make, because let me assure you, some people have challenged me on this. Have said, no, actually. And it's kind of like, yeah, hang on. Do not waste my time. There are fewer people on photo A than B. That's the wrong answer. And I think part of the problem we're facing is that some people then want to have an academic debate about that. So, this is what people do when confronted with that task. Among non-voters and Clinton voters, hardly anybody picks the wrong picture. Why would anyone? Well, probably because the mouse fell off the desk and hit the click button on the wrong, something like that. Or they spilled a cup of coffee and by mistake, you just clicked the wrong button. That can happen. And that error rate is somewhere between 1% and 3%. But now look at Trump voters. Trump voters, up to 26% of them, picked the wrong photo. Now, the 26% are highly educated Trump voters, people who went to college. A quarter of them said, oh no, photo A has more people in it. People with less education who voted for Trump only made that mistake 11% of the time. So what is going on? Well, this is another manifestation, a flow-on effect of what happens when people accept lying demagogues. They themselves then participate in this demagoguery and in this propaganda. And they express their support for Donald Trump by picking the wrong photo. I would argue, in all likelihood, that those people knew full well that there were more people in the other photo. But they also knew that this was politically controversial. They also knew that in this study they were probably asked by a liberal academic to choose a photo with more people in it. And they said to themselves, no way, mate. I'm not going to tell you which photo has more people in it. I'm going to tell you that I voted for Donald Trump. So click A. Okay? That is, in my view, a consequence of what happens when lying becomes a feature rather than a bug. People participate in this. People are not just victims to liars. They themselves express political views similarly by picking the wrong photo. Now here's an interesting wrinkle about this study, or about this event. And the interesting wrinkle is that sometime after this controversy, both Donald Trump, allegedly, and Sean Spicer, for sure, expressed regret over their initial false statements. Sean Spicer, who was fired, by the way, by Donald Trump. They never last long, these guys. They always get fired. After he got fired, some months later, on national TV in the US, he said, well, I should have never made that claim. He expressed regret over having misled the public about the size of the inauguration. Now, this is interesting because where does that leave Donald Trump supporters? They committed themselves to saying, oh, that inauguration crowd was big. Then they find out that actually the person who told them that is now regretting having made that false statement. So what happens to their opinion about the inauguration crowd? Well, one of my students and I looked at this just recently. We just got the data a couple of weeks ago. And what we did was to recruit 400 M-Turkers, 400 American participants online. We asked them for an estimate of the crowds without showing the photos. We've done it with the photos too, but now people no longer pick the wrong photo at all. We're past that stage. So we now just asked Republicans which crowd was bigger, Obama's or Trump's. We then presented the expression of regret by Sean Spicer, or presented an article in the New York Times that corrected this mistaken view about the crowd size very clearly and unambiguously. Turns out those two conditions didn't differ, so I won't report them separately. And then we again asked for a crowd size comparison. So it's a trivial experiment. Tell us which crowd was bigger. Oh, by the way, you know, Obama's was much bigger. Oh, tell me now which crowd size was bigger. A trivial experiment, you would think, and something where people are given every opportunity to change their mind. Here are the data, broken down by who people voted for. Now, to understand the data, it's important to note that the lowest response people could have given there is a 1, which would have meant Obama's crowd was much bigger. And if they had given us a 3, it would have been the same size for both. And a 5 would have been Donald Trump's crowd was much bigger. So that's just to put the data in context, providing you with the scale. And now what happened is kind of interesting. Clinton voters know the right answer, so if we tell them anything, nothing happens. They don't have anywhere to go. The Clinton voters are at the lowest point anyway, and that's the right answer in this case. So our correction doesn't affect them at all. Now, for people who didn't know, or didn't vote, or voted for somebody other than Clinton or Trump, there was a tiny effect of the correction, but again, it was very small. And you could argue that perhaps they didn't have much to go either, because the average is below 2 towards the 1. That means they already knew that Obama's crowd was much bigger. Now look at the Trump voters. They have plenty to go. They're near the middle of the scale, same size to begin with, nearly there. We tell them, oh, Sean Spicer said he regrets telling you that it was bigger, and nothing much happens. Now, there's a significant effect of the correction statistically, but in actual fact, the extent of movement is very slight, even for people who start out at a point away from the floor where they could have moved. So, in this case, because the issue has been politicized and people have a commitment to this phenomenon, not as a fact, but as a political token, the correction has very little effect. So now we know that people are sometimes sensitive to corrections, but if they do change their view on facts, it doesn't affect how they feel about politicians. Moreover, we know that when something has become politicized, they're not even sensitive to corrections of facts, even if it is issued by one of their own partisan spokespeople. So that's the background against which I want to look at how the media handle demagogues. How do the American media respond to Donald Trump? That's my main question for today. And that's a very interesting question, I think, because the conventional wisdom is that the media are one, if not the principal agent in agenda setting, political agenda setting, at least in the United States, but arguably also in other democracies. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that. But is that still the case? Well, I will show you data to suggest that that may no longer be entirely true, because we now have Donald Trump, we have his tweets. And Donald Trump's Twitter feed is extremely interesting. And George Lakoff, provided a very interesting but intuitive taxonomy of Donald Trump's tweets, saying, well, you know, sometimes he uses preemptive framing, sometimes he's just testing public reaction, so he'll tweet something outrageous, and, you know, if nothing happens, then he says, oh, cool, I can get away with it, so he'll follow up. Deflection, he will attack the messenger if he's being attacked, and diversion, diverting attention from real issues. Now, that was Lakoff's terminology. Very little has been done to pin this down. What I want to do today is to report an analysis that focuses on diversion. That is, Donald Trump's ability to distract the media and the public from what is really going on. Now, this is based on some anecdotal evidence, semi-anecdotal, that I reported in a paper published 2 years ago, where I talked about Donald Trump's Twitter campaign against the cast of a stage play on Broadway. The play was called Hamilton, and the cast at the end of a show that was attended by Mike Pence, then the vice president-elect, the cast pleaded for a diverse America and, you know, democracy and all that kind of stuff. And Donald Trump just went wild and blamed the Hamilton cast for all sorts of things. And what happened? Well, what happened was that the public got very interested in this. What I'm showing you here are data from a Google Trends search. The timeline is extending from May 2016 through probably a year later, May 2017. And this is the public's interest in the search terms Trump Hamilton. So something happened, a huge spike in public interest. And there was a lot of media coverage about this Twitter thing. Oh, Donald Trump is going after Broadway actors. Everybody was fascinated. But you know what else happened on the same day? What happened on the same day was that Donald Trump settled a fraud lawsuit against his Trump University for $25 million, including a $1 million penalty to the state of New York. That happened on the same day as the Hamilton play. Did the public know? Did the public care? Well, no, not much. The blue line is interest, public interest, as revealed by Google Trends in the Trump University settlement. And look at this. Relative to Trump Hamilton, just a mere blip. He buried the settlement through a Hamilton play. Arguably, perhaps. That's what I would say, hey, this is suggestive. So let's go and have a look. And this is the conceptual model that we explored in our research. And the idea was this. Whenever the media covers an issue that is harmful to Donald Trump, we would suggest that he tweets something diversionary to distract attention from that. So the more this happens, the more that should happen, hence a plus sign here. Having done that, if he's successful in diversion, then the media should drop that harmful issue, and public interest should be reduced, hence a negative sign here. That's conceptually what would happen statistically. If we can pin this down, that is what should happen if Donald Trump is successful at diverting. So what did we do? Well, we scraped 2 years' worth of all of the New York Times, all of ABC News headlines, the Evening News, 7:30 World News, and all of Donald Trump's tweets. And we then did a statistical analysis, simple regression, that related certain keywords in the media to Donald Trump's tweets, and also Google Trends in order to look at public interest. And we operationalized this by picking one issue that was very clearly not in Donald Trump's interest, that he found threatening. And that is the Mueller investigation into Russian links or influence on the 2016 election campaign. And we then picked the issues that probably would be considered to be his political strengths. Donald Trump loves to talk about the economy. He loves talking about his trade war against China, Little Rocket Man, and the wall and immigration are key concepts to his presidency. So we picked keywords that represented Donald Trump's strengths in his tweets, and we then wanted to see whether coverage of Russia Mueller affected tweets on these unrelated topics and how they in turn affected coverage in the media. Okay? So, here are the data. And I'll go through this at length now because there's a number of analyses and they're all quite interesting. So this is the first question. Does Donald Trump distract? Are there more keywords in his tweets that are favoring his own political strengths after coverage in the New York Times and ABC of Russia Mueller picks up? Okay, does one predict the other? And what we find here is that, yes, he does seem to distract. The more the New York Times talks about Russia, the more he tweets distracting words. The more the New York Times talks about Russia or Mueller, the more he talks about his own accomplishments. ABC News segments, same thing. They have Russia in a headline segment, he tweets more about jobs. They have more about Russia or Mueller, he tweets more about China, Korea, the wall, immigration, whatever. Now, the one thing he's not sensitive to is public interest. Google Trends on Trump-Russia does not predict additional tweets on those diversionary topics, but the media seem to. So that's question number one. We've answered that. There seems to be a flow-on effect of media coverage on Donald Trump's behavior. And it's not that he's tweeting about the same topic. He is tweeting more about something completely different that has nothing to do with the Russia-Mueller investigation. So the next question then is, does the distraction work? Well, what I'm showing you here, first of all, on the diagonal are the regression coefficients between coverage of Russia-Mueller on day one and how that predicts coverage on the subsequent day. And if you look down the diagonal, you find that all of these coefficients are significant. What does that mean? Well, all that means is if the New York Times talks about Russia today, they're quite likely to also talk about Russia tomorrow. Why? Well, because there's inertia in political topics. That's exactly what you would expect. Those are just autocorrelations effectively capturing the inertia. But above and beyond that, does Donald Trump's diversion have an effect on media coverage the next day? And the answer is yes. That is shown in this row. These are the regression coefficients that take his distractions on the previous day to predict Russia, Mueller, and the New York Times, ABC, etc., Google Trends on Trump, Russia, the following day. So this is now looking at Donald Trump tweeting about China, how that affects coverage on Russia, Mueller, the following day. You look at all these coefficients, they're all significant, they all have a negative sign in front of them. His distraction works. We can pick up a statistical effect on media coverage, a reduction in media interest in the Russia-Mueller affair as a function of Donald Trump tweeting about some unrelated stuff. Now, there is a qualification to this result. What I've shown you here is an oversimplification because we found the effect for keywords relating to jobs, China, North Korea, but not, somewhat surprisingly, for a wall and immigration, even though those are some of his core topics, but he does not seem to engage in distraction into that particular sphere. And that raises another general problem about this. We picked these keywords on the assumption that we knew what was going on inside Donald Trump's head, namely that he is saying, oh, I'm now going to distract by pointing to these particular accomplishments of mine. But we don't know that. We don't know what Donald Trump is doing. So what we decided to do is to take this a step further, and we did this by examining the entire vocabulary of Donald Trump's tweets. So we looked at all pairs of words in his tweets, excluding 3 keywords relating to Russia and Mueller, and collusion, because we wanted to see whether he distracts. So we excluded all his tweets about the issue at hand, and then we excluded the usual text analysis stuff. We took out stop words and rare words, et cetera, So we were left with a vocabulary of, I think, 52 words or something, I'm not sure now, and we looked at every single combination of those words in the vocabulary, trying to statistically predict their occurrence from media coverage, and then to see whether that tweet affected subsequent media coverage. And we looked at ABC versus the New York Times, we looked at public interest, and we had all sorts of control conditions and neutral keywords for comparison. So let me now walk you through. Now I have to explain the analysis a bit more so you understand the graphs. I'm going to show you a lot of graphs that are based on understanding what I'm about to explain for the next minute or so. Now, what we did was, for any given pair X, we looked at the number of times those keywords occurred in Donald Trump's tweet as a function of New York Times coverage of Mueller and Russia, or later on other keywords as well, plus a whole bunch of other stuff. We had more than 106 control variables in this. You know, time trends, week, all sorts of other control variables, but we can ignore those because we're only interested in the coefficient, the regression coefficient for the New York Times coverage. Now, having obtained that coefficient, this is Donald Trump's response for that word pair in response to the New York Times coverage. We plot that along the x-axis. Actually, we don't plot the coefficient, we plot its t-value, because then we can directly translate that into statistical significance. And then we also look at New York Times coverage the next day as a function of Donald Trump's tweeting the day before of precisely the same pair of words. So for each pair of words, we obtain 2 coefficients, one relating to Donald Trump's response to the coverage, the other one relating to the response of the media to his tweet. And we do this for every pair of words. So each point on the graphs you're going to see next is a single pair of words. Turns out there's 1,500 or so such pairs. And we can plot that, pairs X, Y, Z, and so on, in this 2-dimensional space. And we can formulate some expectation now. The first expectation is that if nothing is going on, if it's all random, then you should have a point cloud in the middle. That is, there should be no significant deviation either way. Trump tweets something, the media does something, the two aren't correlated. That's if there's no effect. If there is a successful diversion, then we should observe 2 things. We should observe that Donald Trump is tweeting more of certain things, so this should be a point cloud shifted right, significantly so. And if he's successful in that diversion, then the media the next day should talk less about Russia and Mueller. So the points should be below. So the bottom right quadrant is what's critical. If we find points there outside significance bounds, that means that for those word pairs, Donald Trump successfully diverted the public or the media from an unpleasant topic. Okay? Let's have a look. We start out with gardening. Why gardening? Well, because we thought that Donald Trump probably is not terribly interested in gardening, and that the New York Times, when they talk about gardening, probably isn't responding to the president's tweets. Well, and that is basically what we find. This is just to get you used to understanding the graphs. We have 1,500 points on this graph. Most of them are clustered in the middle, inside the significance bounds that are formed by the red lines. Anything outside that is significant, anything inside is not. And if there's one observation you can make is that gardening puts Donald Trump to sleep. Because whenever the New York Times talks about gardening, he tweets less of a lot of different words. Now, we need several comparisons to assess the meaning of these data. So our first control is to say, well, okay, but just to make sure that whatever we're seeing is not observed, not due to chance, let's randomize the Twitter timeline for every single word pair. Let's do the analysis again, but throw out all the temporal information. And then, surely, what you should see is a distribution that is totally in the middle. And if it weren't, I would be very concerned about the nature of our data. So, what do we find? Well, we find precisely what you would expect. The contour lines in the middle, including the 95% contour line in red, that is what you get if you randomize the Twitter timeline. That's our null distribution contained in the very same data, but under expectations where there shouldn't be any relationship between the two. And for gardening, we now have a null distribution, and we have an empirical distribution. Let's push this further. Let's go on to another neutral topic. This is the New York Times talking about the economy. What happens when the New York Times talks about the economy? Donald Trump says, "Thank you very much," and he talks a lot. There are a lot of points over here. He really gets into the economy, says something, yeah, lots of stuff. But does it affect the New York Times? No, not really. There's a couple of points down here in this bottom right quadrant, but not much. So the media don't care. Donald Trump cares a lot about the economy and gets active, unlike for gardening, but the media don't then sort of respond to that. What about skiing? Well, apparently nothing happens. That's a pretty neutral term. What about being vegetarian? Nothing happens. Doesn't even put Donald Trump to sleep. There's absolutely no effect. So we now have a pretty good understanding of what happens if nothing is happening, right? Points are in the middle of this graph, as you would expect from the null distribution. The null distribution and the observed data don't really differ. And crucially, the media are not affected by whatever Donald Trump does. We have not seen any effect on the media yet. Nothing has been low, which would have meant reduced coverage the next day based on Donald Trump's tweets. What about Russia Mueller? There are the data for the New York Times. That looks a little different. Look here. Very large number of dots. That means word pairs in the bottom right quadrant. There are certain words that when Donald Trump sees Russia Mueller coverage, he starts tweeting those word pairs. And guess what? A lot of them involve jobs. But there's also lots of other words in there. And the more he tweets, the less the New York Times reports Russia Mueller the next day. It is suppressing Russia Mueller coverage. And it's not just the New York Times. Here's the ABC headlines. We again have this crucial cluster out here. Outside the null distribution, outside the statistical significance boundaries, a lot of stuff that Donald Trump is tweeting about has the flow-on effect of suppressing media coverage. Not only is he diverting ABC and New York Times, he is also synchronizing their coverage, because the correlations between the coverage in the ABC and New York Times, represented by the t-values along the vertical axis, so the extent of suppression, if you look at these correlations, they range from modest to rather large. And the same correlations are near zero for all the neutral items that I showed you earlier. The ABC and the New York Times do their own thing when they talk about gardening, vegetarianism, skiing, the economy. They do their own thing. But when it comes to Russia-Mueller coverage, they both are synchronized and suppressed by Donald Trump's diversion. Now, you might argue, okay, but surely if this is important, or if this is really happening, then you should have a flow-on effect of this on the public. The public should also be affected by this diversion, shouldn't it? I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be, but let's have a look and see if it is. So for this, we looked at Google Trends data, the keywords Russia-Mueller in a search, showing you precisely the same layout as before, except now the emphasis is not on the bottom right quadrant alone. The emphasis now is on everything below the 0.05 significance line along the vertical axis. Why? Well, because we wouldn't necessarily expect Donald Trump to be sensitive to public interest. Remember that going right or left is Donald Trump's response to the media or to Google Trends. He does not respond to Google Trends. He's not aware of what the public is thinking. He is sensitive to the New York Times and ABC News, but not the public. But the reverse does not hold. The public, like the media, is very sensitive to what Donald Trump is tweeting, because for a large number of vocabulary items, more than you would expect by chance, there is a significant reduction in the public's interest in Russia-Mueller. He's distracting the public from Russia-Mueller by tweeting about something else. That's what these data show. Trump doesn't respond, but the public responds to him. Okay, now, since we're near Brexit land, it is worth putting in one more analysis, one more placebo topic. Because I started out talking about gardening and skiing and vegetarianism and all that. Well, okay, yeah, they're neutral, but gee, they're also so different from Russia-Mueller. You know, we need a better control. We need something that is sort of like Russia-Mueller but doesn't present a threat to Donald Trump. And if there's something that is sort of like Russia-Mueller, it is Brexit, because it's ongoing. You know, we've just entered the first million years of Brexit. It continued throughout the sampling period. It is not under Donald Trump's control, same as Russia-Mueller. Donald Trump, well, he's trying to control Brexit, but I don't think anyone can. That's out of the box. And it is not harmful to him, importantly. In fact, quite on the contrary, Donald Trump is tightly linked to Brexit through various associates and dark money and all sorts of other political variables. So what we should find with Brexit is, well, we don't know, but clearly we don't think he would want to distract from Brexit, and we also don't think that the media would then be distracted from Brexit through Donald Trump. And guess what? That is basically exactly what we find. For the New York Times, coverage of Brexit does increase his Twitter activity for a number of words, but except for a tiny number of word pairings, the New York Times is basically ignoring that. He is not distracting the media from Brexit. He's not distracting the media from anything other than Russia-Mueller, because presumably that is something that is threatening to Donald Trump. And the same holds true for Google Trends. There's absolutely no effect on the public interest in Russia-Mueller as a function of this is Google Trends for Brexit, there's no decline in the public's interest in Brexit as a function of Donald Trump tweeting about it. So it's specific to the one topic that is clearly risky, politically harmful to the president. So, what are the conclusions? I want to wrap it up. This is my last slide. The American public is often, but not always, sensitive to corrections of facts. They do respond. They say, yeah, okay, I'll believe that less. But that has no effect on how they feel about the politician who made the false statement to begin with. Doesn't affect feelings or voting intentions. Moreover, if a fact has become politicized, corrections fail. Then it doesn't matter what you tell people, even if it's one of their own spokespersons who is expressing regret over the audience size. And that is because people sometimes accept a lying demagogue. And they do so, we believe, whenever they have lost faith or trust in a political system. And as far as the media is concerned, they play their part in this because they're sensitive to Donald Trump's distraction. He is diverting the agenda-setting media in America from Russia Mueller by tweeting. And he also diverts the public. Now, whether he does this consciously, knowingly, we can't infer that from our statistics. But we do know for sure that that is what is happening, and there's a message in there for the media, which is to be very aware of how easily it is to give up your agenda-setting role by 280 characters coming out of Donald Trump's thumb. And with that, thank you very much for your attention. And of course, I'm happy to answer questions.
Yeah, thank you very much for this really impressive talk. Fragen. Wir gehen ein bisschen in die Kaffeepause rein. Wir haben etwas später angefangen. Fragen können auch auf Deutsch gestellt werden. Wie gesagt, er versteht jedes Wort, garantiere ich euch. The answer could be in English. So ja, Volker.
They should be aware of what's going on, what they've done in the past. And they should just say, well, hang on, what am I doing here? Why am I talking about this? Why am I dropping this? Why am I preferring that other story? I think, realizing what's going on is the first step towards understanding. And, the thing is, for me, what I do when Donald Trump tweets something outrageous, I say, what's really going on? And then I look at the news and I try to find the story that he's trying to distract from. And very often you can find it. And you sort of go, oh, that is what's happening. Right. Some corruption, there's so much. There's a never-ending set of stories that he would be smart to distract from because they're damaging to him. And you can find them if you take his distracting tweets as a signal to find the underlying story. And I think that's what the New York Times and ABC News should do.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I actually have two follow-up questions. You just mentioned that the New York Times should be aware. Did you talk to the New York Times and the ABC about your findings?
Yes. The Washington Post, not the New York. Okay. Yeah. I've certainly had a long chat with the Washington Post some time ago, and I'm certainly going to talk to the New York Times. I am talking to a lot of journalists, and I will be talking specifically to the New York Times. But at the moment, these data aren't published yet, and I'm a little, they haven't undergone peer review. We just submitted the paper, but we haven't heard back. So I'm a little reluctant to make too much of this until it's peer reviewed. Maybe I'm being old-fashioned, but I still think that I'd rather wait for that.
And the second question is slightly regarding the sentence that's still up there. You say that the New York Times and ABC reduced inconvenient coverage. Did you follow up on, Donald Trump diverted, but did you follow up on what topics the New York Times and ABC jumped onto? Like, did they go up? What you showed on the economy topic, like, sort of indicated that maybe, like, if he tweets about the economy, then they also maybe do fact checking. Maybe it's like similarly inconvenient for him, just not on the same topic as.
Yeah, I know what you mean. And no, we haven't. It gets to be, it's very complicated because, yeah, it's statistically very complicated to formulate a model that somehow takes into account the New York Times initial topic, the momentum within that topic, which we have to represent because of the autocorrelations that are in there, and then a shift to a new topic, which also we would have to consider the autocorrelations for, and then to sort of add a component of Donald Trump's tweets about that new topic. I've tried that, and I wasn't able to discern anything meaningful in that, to be honest. So it's a very interesting question, but I just don't quite know how to capture that. It's non-trivial, I think, unless I'm being really stupid about it. I don't know. Let me know if you have a good answer.
I jump in with a question of my own, and then I have another one. Well, the public relation industry works like this. So are you aware of other works, how their impact is on such issues? So awareness campaigns and such things. And do you think it's something similar which is happening here, or do you imagine that, well, journalists are much more sensitive about public relation? Because in this case, we do not have public relation. We have Donald Trump and his own public relation in the same person.
Well, that's a great question. And I really don't have a good answer. I mean, I guess what you're saying is we should have another comparison in there somewhere, which is not Donald Trump, but some other PR machine that is pumping out stuff and gets into the... Yes. Well, the short answer is we don't have that at the moment. This was about Donald Trump's diversions. Have people looked at that? Well, yes, there is one analysis I can think of was published by Justin Farrell a couple of years ago in Nature Climate Change, where he looked at media coverage in response to climate denial. And he was, I have to look up the exact details, but he was basically able to show that a lot of the talking points from right-wing think tanks that are generating climate denial, a lot of those go into the mainstream. So this sort of infiltration of mainstream coverage by, political operatives, I think that's well established. That does happen. I mean, the framing work that is being done by these think tanks is just incredible. How much they can control the framing of the media agenda. And the media, again, don't know that it's happening to them because all they're doing is to use words, right, that they think are part of public debate. But I mean, these words came from somewhere. And if you trace that back, then you can often find, well, hang on, it was this think tank over here. They came up with that framing. And then they're ruthlessly disciplined. And they say nothing else but use that phrase. Like tax burden. Why is a tax a burden? Why is it not a civilization surcharge, right? That phraseology was generated by conservative think tanks in the US in the 1990s. And it's and you can trace it back to where it came from. And they were ruthlessly disciplined. They talked about nothing but a tax burden. And then the Democrats say, oh yeah, we have to reduce the tax burden. The moment you do that, you're already playing the other side's game. So that framing is extremely powerful and is ongoing. Yeah.
So we take one last question, please.
Well, have you looked at the words that were in the lower right quadrant? So these red points, do they give you any sense? Because they could be from my point of view, they could be a start to look back into the question if ABC and New York Times reacted directly to Trump's tweets, or if any third thing is going on. Everything outside of that is going on.
Yeah, well, we certainly looked at the words, and I have a table of it on my laptop. I can show it to you. It's not in my slides because basically it's the word job and jobs is in there, and in like more than half of all the word pairs. There's also a lot about the police, about patriotism, about China. What's not in there, surprisingly, is anything about the wall or immigration. And that surprised us because we thought, hey, they talk about Russia Mueller, he'll talk about Mexican rapists or something, right? But he doesn't. He talks about the economy, he talks about global foreign policy, patriotism, the military shows up. It's that sort of thing. And yeah, I think you're right. That should be a good seed to look at how that then affects coverage. But we haven't, as I said, found a way to handle that.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think one conclusion should be, just be careful. Das Wort Zufall ist Gotteslästerung, hat Albert Einstein. Soll Albert Einstein mal gesagt haben. Bitte überprüft, ob das Zitat stimmt. Bis dahin eine schöne Kaffeepause. Wir machen um 11 jetzt ein bisschen gekürzt weiter. Volker, hier in dem Saal, glaube ich, wo es auch um statistische und wissenschaftliche Methoden im Journalismus geht. Richtig? Habe ich mir jetzt richtig gemerkt? Okay, ja. Thank you much again, Stephan Lewandowski. Bye-bye.